Good morning, my name is Melanie Norman and I work at Cedars Upper School. I'm going to talk about retrieval practice today, as this is something we've been working on at Cedars. So the aims of today's session is to know what retrieval practice is, to understand why it works based on how the memory works, to be familiar with what the research tells us about retrieval practice, and most importantly, to understand how we can use it in our teaching to support our learners. So firstly then, what is retrieval? Retrieval practice is a learning strategy where we focus on getting information out through the act of retrieval or calling information to mind. Our memory for that information is strengthened and forgetting is less likely to occur. Retrieval practice is a powerful tool for improving learning. This is taken from retrievalpractice.org, a really useful website, and if you haven't had a look at it, I really recommend you do. Some great information and some resources as well. The more often we retrieve knowledge from our complex stores of memory in different ways, those facts, words, concepts and experiences, the stronger those memories will become and the more fluently we can recall them. The more fluent our students become, they will find it easier to explore new knowledge and solve new problems, applying their knowledge to new situations and understand what we read. It's important to say that retrieval practice focuses on recalling information from memory as a learning tool, not as an assessment tool. Having said that, it will give you an insight to what your students are remembering. The benefit of retrieval is that it's designed to be low stakes or no stakes, so it removes all those pressures, stress and anxiety that sometimes get associated with testing students. Let's move on then to look at why it works. To understand why it works, we need to understand the different types of memory and how we learn. We've got the short-term memory in the middle, also known as working memory, and the long-term memory. The diagrams is the multi-store model of memory by Richard Atkinson and Richard Schifrin from 1968. Before the short-term memory, we've got the sensory memory. And this is where new information is seen, heard, smelt, touched or tasted and is then encoded. Afterwards, it passes to the short-term or working memory and it's stored here for a very brief time in our short-term memory. The capacity of the short-term memory is very limited. It varies between a few minutes and a few seconds, depending on individuals. Information that is not then rehearsed is lost from the short-term memory in approximately 18 to 30 seconds. When I learnt this, it really made me think about how I teach in the classroom and what opportunities I give my students to rehearse information. If we rehearse it enough, it stores in the long-term memory. But this isn't enough by itself. We need our students to be able to retrieve it as well. We need them to be able to both store it in their long-term memory and to be able to easily retrieve it to mind as well. I'm sure many of you can relate to this situation, having been in a quiz or having a conversation with friends and know you know something but can't quite retrieve it. It's stored in your long-term memory, but you can't readily or fluently retrieve it. When we're teaching, our long-term aim is to reach automacy with our students. This is when we know things so well, we don't stop to consider each stage of the process. It just happens seamlessly and effortlessly. This is called procedural memory, and when this happens and students are familiar with specific activities or skills, the process becomes automatic so that working memory is freed up and can instead be used to focus on new content or questions instead of how to complete a task. So what does the research say about how effective retrieval practice is? The learning scientists who focus on research about the science of learning, a really useful resource. Definitely worth looking at their website. They've got lots of information that's really helpful. They say that retrieval practice is the most effective study method according to much solid research. And the research demonstrates that this improvement in memory and long-term learning is flexible. So it improves students' complex thinking and their application skills. It improves their organisation of knowledge. It improves their transfer of knowledge to new concepts. In other words, retrieval practice doesn't just lead to memorisation, it also increases their understanding. And because they have a better understanding of the classroom material, by having practice using the information, they can then adapt their knowledge to new situations, to novel questions and related contexts. Some research carried out in 2010 found that practicing retrieval once doubled retention, and repeatedly carrying out retrieval increased retention by 400% compared to someone who studied something once. Then in 2012, they said that just completing 2 or 3 extra retrievals when learning words produces 150% improvement in long-term retention. So with so much research supporting the effectiveness of retrieval, it's no wonder many of us are making sure it's a regular part of our teaching. So let's move on to that most important part. How do we implement it into our teaching? Let's start with the planning first of all. So when thinking about retrieval practice, it's important to make it part of our long-term and short-term planning. We know that spaced retrieval is very important, and when we space out our retrieval, the long-term memory retention increases. Spaced retrieval should be planned into schemes of learning, and students should be taught how to carry this out. So when you look at the curve there, you can see that when you practice something immediately after, 24 hours later, a week later and a month later, you're much more likely to remember it than to forget it. More recently, many subject networks have created retrieval roulettes that can be used to quiz over a period of time. For example, 3 questions from last lesson, 3 from a week ago, and 3 from a month ago. There are many resources out there that allow you to set this up without having to start from scratch. And many are happy to share what they're using. For example, this is Adam Boxer's Retrieval Roulette for GCSE Science. Apologies if there's quite a few science examples in this presentation. That's because I'm a science teacher. So when planning lessons and you are teaching new content, it's very useful to carry out retrieval practice covering prior knowledge that is fundamental to new teaching. I tend to use it at the start of most lessons, but often have 3 retrieval questions at midpoints and at the end of lessons. One of the inhibitors of success with retrieval is if you give it too much time. So you then run out of time to teach the new content. It must be time efficient and should allow time for other teaching. For example, a quick 3 to 4 minute retrieval quiz at the start before covering new content is often sufficient. One of my favourites is the retrieval grid, as it allows a mix of questions based on how long ago they studied the content. It involves everyone, and you can add an element of competition about how many they can answer. The other important thing with retrieval is not only should it be time efficient, they also need to be workload efficient. None of these methods involves the teacher checking the students' written answers, creating unsustainable workload by marking lots of quizzes. A teacher might choose to check the occasional quiz, but I wouldn't say that's routine practice. Quick quizzes are really effective and take minimal time to plan. When thinking about our teaching, the next important thing to consider is that we involve everyone. So we can't just do cold calling of a few individuals. There's a few things you can do to get around this. You could use mini whiteboards and get the students to show you their answers, or you could have set questions displayed for all to answer into their books. If you do want to use the cold calling questioning technique, try giving students time to do it individually and then share their answers first, as then everyone has to fully engage in the activity before you question them. Other activities that work well are giving definitions for key terms or labelling a diagram for memory. They can be a great settler activity for when students are entering the room and can be part of that everyday routine. Another way to involve everyone is to carry out paired retrieval. So get your students to work in pairs to quiz each other on specific aspects of previous work or a particular topic. You could include the use of a knowledge organiser if this helps them as well. One thing I tend to do when I'm including retrieval practice is to specify the knowledge to my students. I like to tell them the lesson before the set of knowledge and any retrieval will be based on, so that they can study, prepare and self-check. Think about the way we used to learn new spellings when we were at primary school, having 10 words to learn and then continually testing ourselves on older words. Retrieval is a really useful way for building a bank of academic vocabulary and for learning other subject-specific facts. Knowledge organisers can also support with this, and you can let your students know which part of the knowledge organisers you'll be focusing on in the next lesson. For me, when thinking about my teaching of retrieval, the most important thing is feedback and metacognition. Feedback is absolutely essential, as if students can't identify gaps in their learning to rectify them, retrieval will have limited impact. The feedback helps improve students' metacognition. Without it, they don't know what they got correct and what they got incorrect during retrieval practice. Providing feedback is a key to powerful retrieval. It does not mean more work for you. It doesn't mean grading or marking lots of quizzes and assignments. Simply discuss or display the answers and have students self-grade their own retrieval practice. Also, when you're giving that feedback, the more elaborate your explanation, the more powerful it will be. So learning and metacognition increase when students receive explanations about why they were correct or incorrect. Giving the students direct instruction in terms of what to do next, whereas they're not memorising yet, helps as well. For instance, some students study hard for tests and don't do well. Usually this is because they're studying what they already know, and they're not spending time studying what they don't know. By engaging in retrieval practice, students are able to evaluate what they know and what they don't know, and then make better study decisions. Improved metacognition also benefits teachers. By seeing what students know and don't know, teachers can adjust their lesson plans and ensure that all students are on the same page, similar to formative assessment. Next thing to consider is home learning. Retrieval practice shouldn't just be for the classroom. It should be a study skill used by students at home, and parents can be shown how to support this. When parents ask their child what they have learned that day, it is helping them retrieve, as they're having to think about what they've learned and explain it to their parents. My favourite task to set for students is to complete at home is flashcards. I always encourage them to have boxes labelled up, and when they get the answer correct, they put the flashcards in one box, and if they get them wrong, they put it in another box. They should continue quizzing themselves on the ones they got wrong daily until they get it right, and then include 2 of the correct cards every time so that they space their practice to support retention. My other go-to retrieval practice I set for home learning is the brain dump for knowledge organiser. I ask them to memorise the content of a specific knowledge organiser or a section of one, and then write down everything they remember onto a blank piece of paper without looking at the knowledge organiser. Also, spaced learning quizzes are really useful for planning retrieval practice for students. I always find it useful to share the language of spaced practice and retrieval with my students and their parents, so that they understand what we're doing and why we're doing it, and why it helps them to memorise more and therefore learn more. As with any teaching and learning strategy, there are some possible pitfalls, but if you know what they are, then you can avoid them so that your retrieval is as effective as possible. First of all, retrieval that is too fact-based and not enough higher order thinking can lead to false confidence. Students can think they know everything and can answer any possible question, but when faced with an exam question where they have to apply the knowledge or evaluate, they can find it more difficult. Secondly, too much time is planned for these and not enough time for teaching new content. There needs to be a good balance of both. So when we spoke earlier about being time efficient and workload efficient, that's really important at this point. And finally, if teachers make them an assessment tool rather than retrieval, that's a pitfall. It's important that they remain low stakes to minimise the stress and anxiety that are often associated with testing. They need to be seen as a learning tool and not an assessment tool. Students should want to remember as much as possible, but not worry if they can't, feeling happy that practice will help them to remember. Okay, so the first pitfall I spoke about was not enough higher order thinking. Let's look at how we can keep the challenge. We need to make the task as difficult as possible while still enabling success. We want the students to get just the right number correct so that they gain confidence, but not overconfidence. You want to give them opportunities to retrieve information and skills that require higher order thinking. This will support improving memory. Wherever possible, try not to let them look things up in the books or knowledge organisers. It can be useful to get students to write comparisons of two things as part of the retrieval process, so that it is not just fact recall. This 5-a-day challenge has a range of tasks, from basic recall and labelling of diagrams, through to explaining the differences. By choosing the more demanding tasks, this will help to give them more impact on their long-term memory. So in summary then, the things we need to think about when planning these into our teaching is that we need to involve everyone, make it part of our regular practice, specify the knowledge so the students know what's coming, make it time and workload efficient so it works for us as teachers but also supports our learners, get the right level of challenge so our students get confident but not overconfident, making them a learning tool, not an assessment tool, so they remain low stakes or no stakes, and making sure that there's spaced practice. We want to make sure that students have an opportunity to practice things over a period of time so that their long-term memory improves. So just to share with you then, the resources I used to produce this presentation included the websites below. I would also recommend these two books, Retrieval Practice by Kate Jones and the Teacher Walkthroughs, which also has a number of examples within it. Thanks for listening.